Amen. All right, so introductions. So I'm Dale Wickizer, and I don't want you to write a single note, except the only thing I want you to write is that email address, because if you send me an email, I will send you this presentation, okay? That way you don't have to take notes. I'd rather you listen and talk. So I want to try and make it informal as possible, okay? Am I a Christian? Yes. For how long? Well, I was originally raised a Catholic, and I've been a Reformed Christian since 1987. And my involvement with apologetics started actually with Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And I guess he and his son Sean have recently revised that. It's really even better than it was then. And I've been teaching apologetics here in some form since about 2006. Okay. Other information, I'm married to Barbara for 39 years, 2 adult children. My background is in electrical and nuclear engineering and technology in general, former Navy officer with submarines, and former CTO, semi-retired now as a cloud engineer, and a member of Burke since 2005. Okay? So, you know, I didn't know how many people were going to be here, but I guess it's fair to ask, you know, in the room, how many people here like to be right? Okay? Are you married?
Yeah.
Give up any hope. You're never going to be right, okay? So, you know, that's right. But, you know, how do you know when you're right? How do you know that? You may think you're right, but how do you know when you're right? Okay? How do you know when anything is true or right? Okay? Is it because someone in authority says so? Is it because it's all over social media and the internet, right? It must be on the internet, it must be true, right? Because everyone around you thinks so and you don't want to make waves? Peer pressure, right? Because you simply hope it is? Because you've studied some compelling evidences and you're convinced?
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully it's more of that, right? How many wrestle with whom or what to believe, right? Let alone who to trust anymore, right? That's a big deal because the culture, thank you, we live in a culture that's deeply divided today. Would you say that's true in our nation? You know, probably not just our nation. We're steeped in moral relativism, calling good evil and evil good, taken captive by all sorts of false philosophies out there, skeptical about everything, whom to trust or what to believe, kind of insane a little bit, you know, out of touch with reality. That's the clinical definition of insanity, is when you've lost touch with reality, right? And I think as a culture we're moving in that direction. Yet convinced something is objectively wrong with the world. I mean, when you talk to most people will say there's something wrong with the world. As Greg says, you know, it's not as it's supposed to be, right? So this is an interesting thing we find ourselves in. And I would say that many struggle with the same question Pilate asked Jesus almost 2,000 years ago: what is truth? Remember that discussion when Jesus said, you know, for this reason I was born, this reason I came into the world was to testify to the truth, and people who hear my voice or are on the side of truth are on my side. He took sides, right? And Pilate asked him, well, what is truth? So what is truth? Well, you know, had Pilate looked at his college notes, you know, and probably saw, you know, Aristotle, you know, he would have seen Aristotle said, hey, to say it what is that it is not, or what is not that it is false. While to say of something what it, you know, to say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, is true. What do you notice about those verbs? What kind of verbs are those? Do you know? Is and right. What are those? What kind of verbs are those? Those are called being verbs, right? Yeah. So with all the being verbs, Aristotle implies that truth is somehow connected to being or existence. Okay? Folks here know R.C. Sproul, or remember R.C. Sproul? He recently passed away. But truth is that which corresponds to reality as it is perceived by God. God would be the author of reality, so obviously he had a clear view of it, right? And so that's a definition. This definition is commonly known as the correspondence theory of truth. And actually, this first came up from John Locke, who was a philosopher in the time of the Revolution, right? And a lot of the founding fathers relied on his philosophy to build our country on. Okay?
Now, is that last phrase in Locke too, as it is perceived by God?
Yes, as it's perceived by God. But he came up with the correspondence theory. I'm not sure if Locke, I think that's an R.C. Sproul part, as perceived by God.
That's what I thought.
Yeah. But the correspondence theory of truth is what was made popular by John Locke early on. Okay. So why is understanding truth so important? Why is it important? Why do we care?
You'll die if you don't.
Yeah, we depend on truth all the time, don't we? You can't live our lives a day without it. Okay. In fact, we demand truth from just about everyone. Right? When you hope the doctor's going to prescribe aspirin, not arsenic, right? You hope that architects and builders are using blueprints that are grounded in and sound design principles, right? You want the truth from stockbrokers and you want the truth from friends. What happens when someone gives you inaccurate information or maybe even lies? How does that make you feel about them?
You want to quit reading Facebook.
Yeah. I mean, it tends to diminish your trust in them, doesn't it? You don't, right? Does that make sense? Right? Okay. So, example, I mean, look at the way the COVID-19 and masks and vaccines and other possible remedies were handled. I mean, what did that do? Has this increased or decreased our trust in the media, the medicine, and science world, government? I mean, you tell me. I mean, has it? Has it improved? Do you trust the CDC and FDA more or less? Yeah.
Is that a rhetorical question?
It is, probably, yeah. Has it united or has it divided the nation? It's divided us, right? And so, move over to religions, and religions make all sorts of truth claims about reality, okay? In fact, one of the doctrines is religious pluralism, which tells us there are many paths to God, and all religions are basically the same and we should learn to coexist, if you've ever seen that bumper sticker. The history behind that, by the way, is not how it's being used. I mean, there's a footnote that tells about the history of it if you're interested. But can't you all just get along, right? You're all basically the same, get along. But that's not true. Why? Why is that not true?
Because all of those other religions do not believe what Christianity believes, because we believe there's one way.
Mm-hmm.
And those others do not believe, well, they believe that they are right.
Mm-hmm.
So they all can't be right.
Right, okay. They all make, right, that's a good set. Each religion has a different teachings about the nature of God and reality, right? And those teachings contradict one another. It's not just that they contradict Christianity, they contradict each other a lot, right? And so interesting things, if there are n things that you have, religions or whatever, right? I mean, if there are n things and they all contradict one another, only one of those can be true, or none, right? So in the case of religion, one is true or atheism is true. Okay?
Of course, but there's a radical position that rejects logic, on which that depends. So
Yes.
if you reject logic,
Then all of them could be true.
then none, yeah.
Right.
And there are core beliefs that do that, or try to do it. I don't think they can do that, but they assume.
That's true. Notice what I just said? That's
Yeah.
true, right? Yeah, okay. It's hard to reject logic if you don't also reject truth.
Yeah.
Okay. So which one is true and how do you know? That's the question, right? Okay, so Christianity, I'm not going to try to prove Christianity here, I don't have time. But Christianity lives or dies on one truth. What is it?
Christ is risen.
Death and resurrection.
I would say it's who Christ is.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, death and resurrection is one of the things Christ did, but who is Jesus Christ is the question, right? Because if Jesus really lived, if he really is the God-man as he claimed, if he fulfilled over 330 prophecies, what are the odds of that, right? If he performed miracles demonstrating his authority over life and death and the forces of nature and evil, as the Bible says, if he died on the cross and rose again from the dead after 3 days in the grave, as he predicted, and was seen by people afterwards, and if he ascended into heaven right before their eyes, right before witnesses, then God exists and Jesus is his son. Christianity alone is true because he said he's the only way, and he's the author and sustainer of all reality as described in the Bible. Now, you have to go through the exercise of proving each one of these things, right, beyond a reasonable doubt. But if these premises are all true, then the conclusion's inescapable. I'm not going to prove these today. I believe them, and if you want to come to the reality check course, we do prove those, okay, in depth. But for the sake of the time today, I won't, okay? Fair with me? So if this argument, if the premises are true, then the conclusion's inescapable, okay? All right? So if Jesus is not the God-man, as Greg said, right, he even said this, we're wasting our time. The Apostle Paul said that in 1 Corinthians 15, right? And in fact, we ought to be pitied, okay? So those are the odds. So interestingly enough, unlike other religions, Christianity is falsifiable, okay? I mean, all you got to do is disprove the resurrection. Boom. We're done. We're toast. Right? Okay? But if we're convinced by the evidence Christianity is true, we are commanded to bring objective truth claims about who Jesus is, God's rescue plan of salvation and his kingdom, to a culture steeped in relativism. Remember those points we made about what the culture we lived in? That's a big challenge. And in fact, Christians are commanded to be disciple makers, right? In Matthew 28, we're commanded to be witnesses, and to be a disciple maker means you have to be witnesses, defenders or case makers, and you got to be ambassadors for the kingdom of God. And the picture I use in my class is a stool where the seat is being a disciple maker, and you have the three legs, and you can't like saw off one of those legs and expect not to fall over, right? We're commanded to be all of these. A lot of people don't see the need for apologetics, for example. Well, excuse me, that's one of the legs of the stools, okay? And in fact, you have to do them all. So,
even though they don't see the need, I think they don't recognize that they're doing apologetics.
Right.
And they need to be told, well, what you just said is actually apologetics.
Sometimes. But I've heard more than once where people say, you can't argue somebody in the kingdom of God.
But on the other hand, that's
Right.
what exactly they do.
Right.
They're a witness, right?
Right.
But I run into that in our own church. That's why I brought that up. I
Yeah.
think it's a big problem. Every church should have apologetics.
Yeah, I agree. But I have a stake in it, so I'm very biased. But anyway, so if truth corresponds to reality, well, what is reality, and how does Christianity come into play in that, right? What is reality? That's an interesting thing. So let's start. I'm going to begin by kind of probing around the edges a little bit, okay? Is reality merely what we see and smell and taste and hear and touch? No, you're shaking your head no. Okay? I agree with you, but
Yeah,
why?
Just thinking about what Greg Kokel was talking about, that we have senses.
That's right. There's something more. There's moral intuition. There's rational intuition. There's other things, right? In psychology today, they basically say that sensory inputs are processed and filtered through our brains. That's that intellectual or rational intuition, right, to create a picture or model or part of the actual world. And I think to a certain degree that's true, right? One implication, though, is that we're limited by our biology, because we don't have minds that are all-seeing, and sometimes, like some of us have problems with some of our senses, right? Maybe I can't hear as well, I don't see as well, okay? So we're limited by our biology. Another one, another implication is that everyone has a different view of reality. Okay, does our biology limit our ability to view reality? Yeah, I think so. Let's look at one example. How about sight? Okay, the wavelengths of light that we perceive make up only a tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum. You see that little Reggie Biv thing right there in the middle? That's about 429 to 750 nanometers, okay? That's where we see everything, okay? And in terms of visual acuity, objects have to subtend at least an arc minute, which is a 60th of a degree, and they have to emit at least 5 to 14 photons before our eyes even pick up something. So we're pretty limited, which is why, you know, we need all sorts of instruments if we want to extend the breadth of that, or we want to, extend the distance at which we could see and so forth. So we use all sorts of things like telescopes and microscopes, infrared sensors. There are animals who don't have that problem. There are many animals that hunt at night, right? They see infrared. We don't see infrared. We're oblivious to it, right? You can use the same analogy on our hearing. On hearing, we hear in 20 to 20 kilohertz roughly range, but you have bats and dolphins and things like that that hear way outside of that range, right? So, yeah, we're limited in our biology, right? Yeah.
I mean, at least 5 to 14 photons. I understand that rhodopsin will respond to 1 photon.
Really?
1 photon hit. Now, it may need 5 to get in, but yeah, if 1 photon hits rhodopsin, it'll do its thing.
Yeah, it'll do it, but you won't register to your brain as something you see, right? And biology isn't the only limit, right? In 2012, they published the results from the Wilkinson Microwave Anisotropy Probe, WMAP, and that showed space-time expansion is accelerating, right? You know, Hugh talked about the dark energy and dark matter part of it, and that was one of the big things that they sought to measure. They concluded but one of the conclusions, besides the age of the universe and confirming some of the nature of dark energy and dark matter, is that they measure that what we can measure with our instruments makes up less than 5% of what's really out there. That ought to be pretty humbling to people steeped in scientism who think science is the only way you learn truth, right? The rest of it is the dark energy and dark matter stuff. So nature limits what we can see. So not only are we limited biologically, but nature limits us. And then we find sin also limits what we see, right? We see that in 1 Corinthians 13, 9 through 10 and 12 there, where it says basically we see through a glass dimly or darkly. And it won't be until after we're with God in the kingdom of God that we actually see things fully, as we're fully seen, right? Cheer up, it gets worse, okay? There was a philosopher named Immanuel Kant, who was 18th century philosopher around the time of the Enlightenment period, very popular back then. His study was epistemology. Do you know what epistemology is? How we know what we know. As a matter of fact, Greg, when he talked about faith, the root word Greek is pistis or pistio, which is where we get the word epistemology from. So faith is knowing, it's a trust, right? And yeah, he's very influential back in the Enlightenment, still influential today. And he believed that space and time were just forms of intuition which structure our experiences. We create these mental models. He almost sounds like that Psychology Today article, or they sound like him more correctly. But we come up with mental models or concepts of objects in the real world empirically through our senses and through reason. But he says we can never actually know the objects in themselves. He says everything on this, in his view, is subjective. Everything, we are agnostic of reality, right? So not only are you limited, you can't know anything about reality, is what his conclusion was, right? And he came up with this word, Weltanschauung. You guys who know Germany would do better at that, but that's the word we get worldview from, okay, Weltanschauung, okay? Kind of worldviewing is,
With respect to physical reality, I think he's right. With respect to physics, when, because your brain puts together what you perceive.
No question, no question your brain does receive things from your senses and put together mental models. That's not the question. The question is, because it does that, can you never know anything about anything at all in reality? You can never, right? That's the question, right?
Well, okay, so he's saying we can't know anything.
We can never know anything about the
about
objects.
physical reality.
Right, we can never know anything about it.
Okay.
It's not that we don't, it is true we put together mental models, but just because we put together mental models, it's not entirely 100% subjective. We can know things about physical things in the real world, is the contra to his argument. So with these limitations, I guess that's the question. Can we truly know anything about reality? Was he right that we cannot know, anything? And is our view... Yeah. that we can't know, right? Is our view of reality only subjective? Could we unknowingly be trapped in the matrix? If you remember that fight scene where Morpheus says, you think that's air you're breathing, right? Hopefully not. The interesting thing is Newton and Kepler and Copernicus, Boyle, other committed Christians, believed just the opposite. They actually believed that the universe was intelligible. The same God that made our mind made the universe, and he made it intelligible, and by studying it, we could learn more about God, its creator. That was the foundation of modern science, right? Okay? Kant's philosophy sought to undermine both science and belief in God, and honestly, it was the precursor to today's relativism, okay? So I want to teach you a little tactic. I'm going to go a little detour here. I'll teach you the Roadrunner tactic. So this is a tactic. I'm an old guy. I used to grow up as a kid watching the Roadrunner and Coyote. Have you guys ever seen that cartoon? Okay.
I still watch.
Okay. So every time the coyote tried to do something, it would blow up in his face, right? And so this tactic by Norm Geisler, it was named after that cartoon, but essentially it uses one of the axiomatic laws of logic, which is the law of non-contradiction, to identify self-refuting, therefore false arguments. Do you know what the law of non-contradiction is? Something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same relationship. Okay? All right? Therefore, it exposes assertions that kind of fail their own test. So, in other words, when you take the standard that they assert and you apply it to the assertion itself, it blows up. Okay? We'll apply that to Kant's assertion. So, Kant, he knows there are real objects in reality. He asserts we can never know the object in themselves. We can only know reality subjectively. Do you see the problem with that logic? What is it?
These are real objects, but we can never know the objects. It's a contradiction.
Okay. You're close. Okay. He's putting forth an objective truth claim about reality, right? He says he knows there are real objects out there. How does he know that? If you can't know anything about reality, how do you even know there are real objects out there? Right? But he says no one, including Kant, can know anything objectively about it. So basically, if we can never know anything about reality, how does Kant know this? Okay? Is he no one? Is he omniscient? What's going on here, right? Do you see how that fails? Do you see how that fails its own test? Okay? So the conclusion is despite the other limitations mentioned earlier, we can know some things about reality, right? Either through our senses or by sound reasoning. The fact we are limited, though, that should be humbling.
Yeah.
That should be humbling, right? That we don't have all the answers. And I always tell people I've been married long enough to know I could be wrong. So I always couch it that way. So, okay, so whatever reality is, people also seem to try to avoid it. You ever notice that? Right? By altering their mental states or even their appearance. Drugs and alcohol, age-old problem, even for old Noah, right? First thing off the boat, what does he do? He gets drunk on wine. Next thing you know, he's laying naked in his tent and causing all sorts of problems, right? Okay, yeah. Pornography, movies and TV shows. Who binge watches Netflix? Anybody here besides me? Okay, yeah. Okay. Gambling sometimes. First-person shooter and other gaming. Social media, social justice from the convenience of your own home. Gender reassignment stuff that's going on. I mean, that's like the extreme case. Imagine, when they get artificial intelligence and actual virtual reality that becomes more mainstream, how it's going to make it even worse, I think. Yeah, right.
That's coming.
Yeah, yeah. So why and I don't know why gambling's on there. Okay, I'll let it. Why the escapism?
Because it gives you endorphins and
Yeah, that's
things
true.
that, make you feel better temporarily.
Yeah, that's fair. What are you trying to avoid? Yeah.
The hard stuff.
Like what? Give me examples.
Kids.
Okay, now you're getting convicting. No, what else? What else?
From your job or.
Yeah, stress.
Yeah. You forgot to put exercise up there too, because people can be extreme exercise.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
With virtual reality, though, it's so realistic. People don't realize they're escaping it. They think it's reality.
Yeah.
That's one of the dangers.
That's one of the dangers of it.
They think even at work, when you do stuff at work that's virtual,
Yeah.
you don't realize that's really escaping the
Yeah.
interaction.
You know that phrase that in the Bible about escaping, about covering over truth and trading the truth of God for a lie, right? I mean, that's effectively what's going on here, right? Yeah. But they're trying to avoid pain and evil, suffering, fear, frustration, helplessness, discouragement, disillusionment. I mean, these are the things, right? Loneliness. Yeah, there's a bunch of them, right? Which are all part of reality, okay? And
I asked a smoker once what they think about when they're smoking out in the cold.
yeah,
And she told me, she says in her imagination she's a goddess and she's in charge and she has this whole thing.
wow.
And it gave me insight into why people do things like that. Because you look at they're miserable people.
What is she smoking? So, to avoid God, right? People like to also avoid God. Why? Because there's something wrong with us. And if he exists, I don't know if you've ever saw the old Lucille Ball. We have some splaining to do, right? Okay, yeah. So I'm not going to delve into it deeply here, and if we have time, I'll come back to this a little bit, but there's a whole thing in here on suffering, and one of the guys is teaching a breakout session on suffering and evil, but I'm just going to kind of address it quickly. Suffering and evil are probably the most difficult existential problems we face. They can cause us to question God's sovereignty and goodness, right? Some even try to use the problem of evil and suffering to disprove God's existence, which is nonsense. There are a couple of great videos from William Lane Craig. I put the links in here. Like I said, you email this, I'll give it to you. If we have time later, these are the total is about 12 minutes. If we have time, I can watch them with you if you want. I'm happy to. They never get old. But if not, the links are here, okay? One is the logical problem, and the other is the probability version of it, okay? Great videos to help address it. But the bottom line is that suffering and evil are part of our story as Christians, right? I mean, Jesus told us to expect it, right? If the world hated me, they're going to hate you, So, yeah, and the suffering and evil, frankly, comes from the fact that when we rebelled against God, we paved the way for human sin and suffering and death to enter the world. I mean, Greg Koukl, in his book, The Story of Reality, if you don't get it, get it now. It's a good book. Basically, he says we broke the world, right? We did. When we rebelled, we broke the world. And God had to send his son to rescue us from the mess we created because we can't rescue ourselves, right? But ultimately, God's going to fix the problem, So that brief aside, I mean, there's the reason for the evil and suffering because we have free will, right?
Yeah, that's like a great statement right now too, because we think, well, I don't know, I'm not going to say we, but there are a lot of people who think, oh, this one man's going to save America.
Yeah.
Well, guess what?
Yeah. Wrong. Wrong. Yeah. The one thing Kahn got right, though, is his idea of the mental model, as you pointed out, right? a worldview, right? And other people use an analogy of a lens to view reality, which is what I'll use here. In Greg's book, The Story of Reality, he actually talks about it as a picture of reality. He uses the analogy of a puzzle that people haven't yet put together. And sometimes they put puzzle pieces from other puzzles in there that don't fit, right? Like New Age or some weirdness, right? Open theology or some weird piece, okay? So it's a good analogy as well. James Sire has a more, I won't read the whole thing here, but the worldview that we have, right? We've got all sorts of things in there. We've got things we know for certain. We've got things that I think I know. There are things we haven't even looked at yet. There are things that are contradictory that we somehow rationalize. It's called, what's that called? Cognitive dissonance. We all live with that sometimes, right? And the point is that we still use this thing to make decisions on how we live our lives, right? So the whole point of a worldview as you mature is to calibrate that worldview over time with something more like a prime standard that weeds out the stuff that's false and contradictory and stuff like that, right? So we change over time, right? Okay? Everyone has a worldview, that whether they know it or not, and the question is it an accurate one or not? That's the real question, okay? And if you're going to choose the right lens, then hopefully the lens that you have on reality, this view of reality, is going to be one that helps us address some big questions. What are some of the big questions in life?
What's for dinner?
No, that's not a big question.
Probably origins.
Origin, where do we come from? What else?
Is there a God?
Is there a God? That's a great one, right? Where we are.
I?
Who am I? We're in the grand scheme of things. What else? Purpose? Why am I here, right? What else? Good. What's going to happen in the future, right?
Heaven, hell.
Right, which is destiny, right? Yeah, you guys are great, see? What's wrong with the world? Why so much evil and suffering? Morality, what's the standard for good and evil? You talk to me all the time about this problem of good and evil. What's the standard for good? How do I know when something's good or evil even, right? What kind of people should we be? Meaning, right? Identity, destiny. You guys are great. You do this. This is great. How do we get the most accurate view of reality? I mean, we talked about how we're limited biologically. We talked about how nature limits us. We talked about how sin limits us. So on our own, we have a very limited view of reality. We need some help, right? We need a different prescription if we're going to use the lens analogy. So where do we turn? Where do we turn for the most accurate view of reality?
Where should we turn, or where do we
Where should we turn?
The Bible.
Okay, where does the Bible point to?
Jesus.
To Jesus or God, right? The author of reality, right? We need revelation from God to explain things about reality that we don't have access to, okay? The author tells us that reality. Remember when we talked about the correspondence theory and we said, as it's perceived by God, because God has a complete view of reality, right? He made it, okay? And so he created all this, so we would not have access to this. So what are the main ways God has revealed himself in reality? What are the ways?
RTB talks about two books, doctrine through the scripture and through creation.
Very good. Very good. The two books analogy, nature, which is the general revelation, which points us to God and reveals his eternal power and his divine nature, right? And the Bible, specific revelation, where God reveals more about himself, his character, his steadfast love for us, his rescue plan, right? His purpose, right? So yeah, this is great. So, and we see this, even though in Psalm 19 it talks about the heavens declaring, the stars declaring. There's no languages where it's not where it's not under. I mean, it's understood by all languages, right? And the Bible is making a statement of something that is true before the first word of the Bible was ever written. Before the first word of the Bible was ever written, nature was out there declaring the glory of God, right? Okay? And we see that also in Romans 1:18, where it talks about, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them in the things he's made, right? Okay? Yeah, we're without excuse. And that was before the first word of the Bible was ever written, okay? But when you get into the Bible, in terms of the nature of God and the nature of Jesus and so forth, we understand that the Bible reveals Jesus is the uncaused cause of everything, right? In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. They're talking about Jesus pre-incarnate, right? All things were made, through him all things were made, okay? And we see that also in Colossians 1, 15 through 16, where it talks about Jesus being the image, the icon. That's a coinage term, right? Where the icon, God's very nature stamped on him, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. And then further on, it goes on and says it reveals that he sustains everything. So when you say the Lord's Prayer and you say, give us this day our daily bread, that's the least God does for you, right? Think about this for a moment. Jesus holds all of creation together moment by moment. If he were to withdraw that for a single moment, everything would cease to be. Okay? Wow. Okay? Wow. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of nature. He upholds the universe by the word of his power. Okay? And then God also reveals his plan and purpose. For God so loved the world that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. We see that in John 3:16. 2 Corinthians 5:20 and 21, one of my favorite verses, where it says, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. For our sake he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Okay? And then lastly, in Ephesians 2:8 through 10, for it is grace by you have been saved through faith, and this is not of yourselves, it's a gift of God, right? We're God's handiwork. So, okay. So what are some of the things God revealed about himself? Provider. Okay. What else?
Well, in his revelation to Moses, giving his name,
I am.
very fundamental to everything.
Right. The self-existent one, right? He has a satiety, which he's eternal, right? He's a necessary being. Okay, great. What else?
He's 3 in 1.
Yeah, 3 who's, 1 what? Right? 3 who's, 1 what? Okay. What else? You guys are doing great.
Miracles. He had many miracles.
Yeah, well, I mean, if he holds together the universe moment to moment, a miracle's probably, walk in the park, right? Okay, yeah.
His relationship aspect, in other words, unlike, say, Allah, who's remote out there, he is a God who wants to relate because he's communicating to you.
Yes, right. He's relational.
And personal. He's got a personality.
Right, very good. You guys are great, okay? His most important attribute is that he's holy, holy, holy. I think that's one of the biggest things. 2 things that we underestimate. The holiness of God and how important that is, and the wickedness of our sin.
Yeah.
Okay? If we had a grip on either of those 2, a better grip, I think it would be a different world right now. Okay? We don't. He is self-existent and eternal. He's all the omnis, omnipresent, omniscient, omnipotent. Okay? But we see that he's also very humble. I always like to ask the question, okay, what is stronger, omnipotence or the self-control to restrain it?
That's what the Lord of the Rings is all about. That's what makes that a great novel.
Yes.
Because instead of going to get something of power, they had to get rid of the ring of power.
Mm-hmm.
And the answer to your question is the ability to control it.
It is. Self-control is a remarkable thing, one of the fruits of the Holy Spirit, right?
And sometimes it's hard.
And very hard. It's one of our battles of the flesh, right? It is. But he's humble, he's wise, he's patient, just loving. You can't be loving without being relational, right? Compassionate, generous, gracious, forgiving, but wrathful. I mean, and I stop to think sometimes, how horrible must our sin be? Because God's default nature is to be these things: humble, wise, generous, patient. How horrible must our sin have been to drive such a being to wrath? That's not his default state, okay? He's designer, creator, and sustainer of all things through his Son, and his great love for us. He showed his great love for us by sending his Son to rescue us, right? Okay? So, what else has God revealed about reality itself, okay? There's an entire spiritual realm and dimensionality out there beyond our perception. We live in a 4D space-time, right? They think that reality is, what, Steve? At least 10 dimensions, maybe more, right? Okay? I used to deal, early on in my career, back when the earth cooled, I used to deal with tensor math, where you had to put a 9-dimensional tensor term to make the equations work. When I worked with Maxwell's equations in electromagnetism, or I worked with the Navier-Stokes equation in fluid dynamics, you had to use tensors to make the math work out to solve real problems, okay? So 9 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension, 10 dimensions at least, right? Okay, yeah.
You can get quantum gravity.
Yeah.
You have those.
You use tensor math and that stuff too, yeah. Electrodynamics and stuff like that. But so God's kingdom, which will be established here on earth, is one of the things we never really understood, that God made a kingdom for himself, right? And Jesus introduced that kingdom, right? When he walked the earth, and it's coming in power and glory when he returns. God's temple and throne. God's heavenly army is host, right? These are powerful interdimensional beings if you think about it. A cherubim, a seraphim. Do you remember the story of Hezekiah? Right? What did one angel do that one night after Hezekiah spread the letter out from Sennacherib on God's altar? And God sent one angel. What did he do that night? Do you remember? He killed 185,000 hardened soldiers. One angel. Just one angel. Okay? Whoa. Okay? These are, not to be trivial, not to be trifled with, right? We talk about also in Ephesians 6, rulers, authorities, cosmic powers, spiritual forces of evil. Here we're talking about Lucifer, or the Satan, the serpent, the devil. We're talking about his demons, all those things, right? And Christ exercised authority over all of these, casting out demons and so forth. He had control over the power of evil, right? So can you think of some of the traits then, if we talk about, those big questions and this extra spiritual dimensionality, all this stuff, can you think of some traits of an accurate worldview then? Because the goal of this is we want a more accurate worldview so we can more clearly see reality. What kind of traits would we expect out of a good worldview?
Moral.
Okay.
Right and wrong.
Right and wrong. Okay. What else? How about it ought to be logically coherent with the big questions, right? So one of those questions was morality. So when you talk about those 6 things we talked about, it ought to be logically coherent, right, in answering those big questions. So when it answers, hey, where did we come from, origins, the answer ought to be at least logically coherent and not contradictory, right? Okay? Empirically adequate, it ought to be able to be supported by more, when you're answering those questions and you have to prove it, it ought to have more than one line of evidence. Okay? And it ought to explain all the data. The best explanation of the data.
Right.
That's the law of rational inference, which is an axiomatic law of logic. But most importantly, it ought to be livable. It ought to be not something that's too complex, something you can live your life by, right? Okay? And defensible. It ought to be able to refute contrary worldviews. Can you think of some worldviews lacking in some of these traits?
Young earthism and theistic evolution.
Okay, why?
Because young earthism does not explain all the data and makes up its own explanations. And theistic evolution is a contradiction in terms, because evolution means God's not involved, and then you stick the word theism there that says God is involved. So you're saying God is involved, but God's not involved.
Well, I would say, so I'm not a theistic evolutionist, but I would say that's a straw man for what they believe. But I'd be careful.
No, I know, but they recognize.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand why you call it a straw man.
Yeah.
They recognize you can be more specific about scriptures about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But adopting a complete Darwinian
Yeah.
view.
I've because I'm not one of those, and
Yeah,
I had I had a good friend who is. I took great pains to better understand his point of view, and actually, when you compare people who are more into specific creative acts of God, right, which I am, and many of the old earthers are, right, compared to theistic evolution, it's really an argument over the degree of primary versus secondary causes.
Yeah, that's why there's a
Okay.
spectrum on it. You're right.
Yeah. So I'd just be careful.
No, you're right. That was
Okay. But I don't hold to that either. So so I agree with you. But okay. Well, I was thinking like scientism
yeah.
is a great example, right? Because here they say truth can only be known from the scientific method. Well, this is self-refuting. Can you tell me why that's self-refuting?
Because that statement's not known by the
Yeah.
scientific.
Tell me the scientific experiment you ran to prove the truth of that statement.
Yeah.
They haven't run it. They haven't run it, right? I'd say atheism, which relies solely on materialism. If you're truly a staunch atheist, you don't believe in free will. Like Greg said up on the stage, I liked how he said it, we're meat all the way down, right? You don't have free will. You're dancing to your DNA, as Richard Dawkins says, or there is no mind and brain separation. Therefore, you're just the product of electrical, chemical firings in your brain, and you have no choice in the matter. Well, if you don't have choice, you can't have morals, right? Which means they surrender all their right to moral outrage, okay? And it's self-refuting and unlivable. They can't live it. Now, I've known several atheists who actually act morally, but they get that from their parents and their grandparents, okay? They borrow. They steal somebody else's capital, right? Yeah. I'd say Hinduism.
Yeah.
Okay, everything is, God is everything, everything is God, everything including good and evil is an illusion. Well, if it's an illusion, then why do you have karma and this endless cycle of reincarnation and rebirth trying to pay for past problems? If they're illusions, why are they problems? I don't understand that.
Not only that, just
Yeah.
the whole, it's part of their government too.
Yeah, well, it's,
And
yeah.
it's just such poverty and caste system and
Yeah, yeah.
animals everywhere.
Yeah. So, okay. So, we mentioned earlier about religious pluralism. I want to unpack that a little bit here now in the context of a worldview and getting into this idea of reality. Okay, we mentioned earlier that religious pluralism is false because, not all the conflicting pictures of reality can be true. Each of them has a picture of reality. They can't all be true because they contradict one another. I don't think atheism, I think there's a strong case because of the moral argument that atheism is not true and the fact that it relies on scientism, which is self-refuting. So which one is the true one? Once again, I go back to that logical argument at the beginning, and that is if Jesus is the God-man, then Christianity is the only true picture of reality because it answers the big questions that all worldviews must answer. It addresses the problem of pain, suffering, and evil. We know it's part of the story. We know it's because of our free will initially, and we did bad things with our free will, right? We broke the world, as Greg says. It shines light on our tendency to avoid God and reality. It addresses what to do with our guilt and shame. None of the other worldviews do. It shows us the way of salvation that we can't rescue ourselves. It teaches how sinners can be reconciled to a holy God, and it offers hope.
That's a big one.
It offers hope, right?
No other hope.
There is no other hope, right? So bottom line, okay, great. What is reality then? One simple definition, reality is the way things are ontologically. So when I use the term ontological, do you know what that is?
Beings.
It's the study of being, right? Okay? What does it include, whether we perceive it or not? Well, it includes the necessary being who created it all, God, right? Holy, omniscient, kind, generous, source of all reality. He's both transcendent and immanent, right? Spiritual realm, this whole spiritual realm out there that we don't see. I mean, do you remember the story of Elisha and his servant? When the king's army surrounded Elisha and his servant was saying, oh no, what are we going to do? And Elisha said, don't fear. You know, they that are with us are more than they that are with them. Remember that story in the Bible? And he prayed that the servant's eyes would be open. And what happened when the servant's eyes were open? What did he see? He saw angels and chariots of fire surrounding, you know, the physical armies out there, right? Okay? Wow. Immaterial or metaphysical things are also part of reality. Logic, mathematics, the laws of physics, semiotics, moral law, good, evil, beauty, pain, suffering, all these things are part of reality, but they're not, but they're metaphysical in nature, right? Okay? All contingent being. If God's a necessary being, all other beings contingent upon him, right? So that includes humans, it includes who are made in God's image, it includes angels, demons, you know, animals, insects, plants, bacteria, germs, all that, right? All matter, everything from the big galaxies down to, you know, leptons and bosons and dark matter, okay? It includes all energy, matter and motion, because of the forces that are out there, including dark energy, okay? So that's a lot of stuff. And God holds all that together with his word, moment to moment, right? Yeah.
Very thorough. I do have a question which I wanted you to comment on, since the Nobel Prize just came out last week in quantum entanglement. Now, Niels Bohr and Einstein discussed this for 30 years, went back and forth. But now what's on the line is realism and locality.
Right.
Now, how is realism related to reality? You know, that's a discussion, but the point is now this is now out in the public. It's already in the public conversation, questioning reality based on that.
Yeah.
And it's been around for some time, but now because of the Nobel Prize, it's headlines, and we should be aware of it and how to approach that. So,
I still have a problem with quantum.
with quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's
Well,
what
no, I have a problem with the direction quantum physics is headed. I have no problem with quanta of light and photons and things of that nature, which was the original theory. I have a problem with the fact that they've taken the Heisenberg uncertainty principle beyond. I think at its core, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is our inability to measure certain things.
See, that's what it's not.
But I think that's what it is.
So you're on that part, Stan.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that the quantum entanglement does show that realism and locality are not?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I haven't studied.
that's
Recently, I haven't studied it in depth to know. So
Yeah.
I would be talking outside of school. I'd have to actually study it more. I tend, me personally, because I don't have time to delve into every area of science, I basically have said, these guys still haven't gotten over the fact that it's a limit of our ability to measure things, you know, but I could be wrong.
I think that's refutable. That's what you would have to refute, and it was unable to be refuted, which is why they got the Nobel Prize. So what you're basically up against, if you're taking that view, is to challenge the Nobel laureates.
No, I'd have to study it. Yeah, I'd have to study it.
It's worth it. It's definitely worth it.
Yeah, I'd have to look into it, but you know, yeah, I mean, with the whole quantum computing thing, you're not going to be able to avoid it, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And
So.
in other realms, now we've entered a new era. We're in the quantum era now.
Right.
That will define the 21st century.
Right. Yeah. Good point.
Just like relativity defines.
Good point. So I'm still old school. I have to
You're still
study.
20th century.
I still have to study it. You know.
It's worth it. I'm telling you, though.
I still.
Worth it, and there's a lot that we can use apologetically in it.
Yeah. I'll have to study it. Okay. So what does reality exclude? What's not in reality? Lies? Right? If the truth corresponds to reality, then yeah, falsehood, lies, error in all forms, violations of the laws of logic, contradictions, logical fallacies, these are not part of reality, right? Okay? Maybe I should put up here quantum electrodynamics. No. But
You know what's crazy is a lot of this stuff is being pushed on
Yes.
us.
Yes.
You're right.
Like, some of the stuff they're being pushed on is
Yeah.
literal insanity. These
Yeah.
people have mental illness.
Yeah, I told you. That isn't that what I said on the first one of the first charts, right? Yeah. Okay, so what? So we covered all this stuff. So what? So what? Well, I would say we are very, we've learned we're very limited in what we can know on our own of reality, right? Apart from revelation by the author, we don't know much. We have to really depend on God, the author of reality, I think, to enlighten us as to what reality includes. And even then, we're probably limited, right? If Christianity is true, it offers the best explanation of reality, revealing its author, his nature, what's wrong with the world, his purpose, his plan to fix it, and the plan of salvation, okay? Greg Koukle's book, Story of Reality, get it if you don't have it. It was a great book, okay? It's a great, the reason it's a great book is it feels like you're sitting around a campfire and your parents and grandparents are telling you stories from the past, and it's a great something you can give to a non-believer, okay? We've learned also, one interesting thing we've learned is, God's plan, this is not just our story, this is the story for everybody. The good news, everybody lives forever. The bad news is everybody lives forever, right? Yeah. Some are going to be living with God, others are going to be living apart from God, right? So the consequences are eternal, and God calls us to be part of that plan as disciple makers. And truth, which corresponds to reality, you know what? It's instrumental to that endeavor because we're making objective truth claims about the nature of Christ and things he did, the person and the work of Christ, right? To a world that's steeped in relativism. We should engage in that commission, though, with confidence because you know what? We have reality on our side. I mean, we know the author, right? And we ought to, if we're timid about evangelism, we shouldn't be. Ultimately, reality's on our side, okay? Does that help? I mean, that's part of this besides giving glory to God. I wanted to give people a shot in the arm. That's a big deal, right? We ought to be, we ought to be out there telling people because time's limited for us, okay? You have my email address. If you want a copy of these slides, I'm more than happy to, I'll send you a PDF version of it if that's okay. And I just wanted to thank, Greg for his book, The Story of Reality. I recommend it to you if you haven't got it.
Is it out there? I'm gonna go get
It is. You can buy it in the they have it on Amazon too in Kindle. I think I got a Kindle version. They had it on sale for $3.99.
Yeah, sometimes it's good to have a paper copy.
No, but if you want, particularly if you can get Greg to sign it for you, he will.
That'll be worth something.
Yeah. Does that help? Is that a
That's good.
reasonable
Really good.
covering? So I got to brush up on my my quantum and my electrodynamics.
Specifically on entanglement, that's what the thing is for. And the reason it got the prize because of the practical aspects. It's not just theoretical anymore. There's computers, there's a whole bunch of stuff coming out for it. But the questioning of realism will definitely spin your brain around a little bit.
Well, the whole quantum endeavor, though, I think, came because I think the perception I have, which it could be wrong, the perception I had is when they came out with the Big Bang cosmology, right? Then this notion of something from nothing, right? Hey, yeah. They squeezed it. They squeezed it, for that first 10 to the 35th minus 35th. Yeah.
He's got a good answer for that of the problem, and it's empirically based.
Yeah.
His answer on that one is good. But yeah, it's out there, and it's fun to read.
But I think some of it was trying to avoid the beginning.
Well, that's what they're doing now with it.
Right.
But the original experiment, Bell's experiment, and the ones that have been done, Bell's theorem, that you're going to have to refute that in order to defend your view at this point. In other words, Einstein was wrong on his opinion there. And that's what I think they're going to go there because atheists have been going to the quantum realm, escaping there for some paradigm now. Now they're gonna
Right.
use this, and you'll hear kids talking about it and stuff, so
Yeah.
I think there are some good, maybe I'll go write a book on it.
There you go.
No, I'm not that smart on it, that's not my field. But yeah, that has to do with reality, and I don't know what realism, is realism reality? What's the connection there? I don't know. Realism means that the thing is not, the particle doesn't exist. It does in a state until you measure it. Locality means, non-locality means it's not in a particular spot, it's in different spots, it's superposition,
Well,
until you measure it.
yeah. So my whole point, the whole point about the Heisenberg uncertainty principle is that principle was it was impossible to measure both the spin and momentum of a particle at any given time, because the moment you inject any sort of instrument in there, you affect the environment.
Right.
And it's impossible to measure both,
Yeah.
right?
Because the
Which,
observer becomes
right,
part of the
and
experiment.
right, and so, yeah, but it's been a long time, so I'd have to go back and look.
Yeah, it's definitely worth
Yeah.
voting up on that, because it's in the news now, literally, as we speak.
Yeah, once again, one of those reality avoidance techniques, I think.
Yeah, it can be.
Yeah. Anyway,
Thank you.
thank you so much, for your patience, and
Is it lunchtime?
I hope it was useful.